when Lisa invited me to give this talk a long time ago, she asked me to share my insights on ornithology and conservation in the region. And I spent ages agonizing over doing this talk. And what I would say, because in truth, 45 minutes is a very short time to talk about conservation in a place like the Caribbean that's so politically diverse, of course biologically diverse, and so certainly sociologically diverse. So I had to put down a roadmap of how I would do this. And so I put this roadmap up for you to help you understand what I hope to do with this talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about my own personal journey here, the perspectives that I've had, talk about our current context for conservation in the Caribbean as much as I understand it, because today I live in the United Kingdom. And so I'm a little bit distant from the place that I usually call home and where I work. And then what I'd like to do is take a special turn on scenarios and scenario planning, and give you some insights that I've got and what I think is feasible. And then hopefully talk to you all about how we potentially bend the curve, as my students are fond of saying. How do we change things? And hopefully we'll have time for questions, though I suspect that we might run out of time, Adriana. So, you know, actually I took the bio that I sent you, Lisa and Adriana, and I put it through one of these word clouds, and this is what it spit out for me. And it was telling that actually this thing is pretty good. And what I wanted to do with this slide is to talk to you about my positionality. Now, why is that important? And we hardly use that term in ecology. But the truth is that a lot of our conservation requires us to be really clear in our communication to the various audiences that we speak to. And certainly for me as a scientist, our science is not value-free, okay? And for me, I think I spent a lot of time throughout my career trying to get policymakers, governments to use science to help decision making. And I think a key element of making sure that people understand where you're coming from is that they have a clear idea of where you stand in the discourse on conservation. And so I put up some words here to help you understand who I am. So, you know, I'm born in the Caribbean, but I was trained in America. I'm a conservation generalist, which in the place where I work is really rare, because everybody works up with one teeny tiny thing in my office. And a lot of my professional career is on applied questions in conservation. I'm black, I'm middle-aged, so I wasn't always like this. I was young, like a lot of faces in this room once. And I reside in the UK today, which also makes my perspective different than, say, what it was 30 years ago. So yeah, as scientists, we all try to be as objective as we can, but in truth, being objective is really a difficult thing. And I wanted to make sure that when I talk about what I think are the options or the priorities, that I do a good job of telling you where I'm coming from. And I want to say that regardless of what our professions are, what we get trained in, we all approach this with values. So I wanted this collage that I put together for you to be clear, that, you know, that I've worked on multiple different things on multiple different kinds of questions on 3 or 4 different islands in the Caribbean. So my focus is really on the small community of people working in these islands trying to conserve biodiversity here. But that story, that's only part of the story, right? Because that only talks about how I've been trained and some of the interactions I've had. But what about values? What are the things that we value as conservation professionals? Well, for you to understand me and understand the things that I want to talk about, then you need to understand where I've been, at least in terms of the evolution of my values. And so I put up this photo of the shack, and I've already met a couple friends from Wisconsin here. I put up this photo of Leopold's shack because for me it was, again, a formative moment to go out there the first time. The first time I went out to Leopold's shack, I got to go out there with a friend, Rebecca Christoffel, and she took me out there and set me loose on Leopold's property, and I got to spend the whole day there. and then cross the street and speak to Leopold's daughter, Nina. And for me, that was transformational. I'd read the San County Almanac before I went to grad school, and Leopold's words resonated with me. And so when you talk to me about conservation, I want to be clear about where I'm coming from. And if you want to know Howard Nelson, what Howard Nelson thinks about biodiversity and nature and people's place in it, then probably go read the San County Almanac, and you'll probably know me. So I want to use some of Leopold's words now to shift gears. So all Leopold wrote in the foreword to a San County Almanac in 1948 that we should make shift with the way things are. And so I want to make shift with the way things are in the Caribbean. And so I think I'll start with the habitats for birds in the Caribbean. And I think if you look at the data for birds in the Caribbean, the picture is kind of optimistic compared to some places around the world that my students work in. So in terms of conservation, we've seen a bounce back in forest cover. We've seen a recovery. And for those folks that work in spatial planning, they call this a forest transitions pattern, where because of changes in human demographic patterns, urbanization, decline of agriculture, a lot of places in the Caribbean you've seen forest cover increase, and we've seen that, for instance, in Puerto Rico. And so we've got a great example here. And we think that the percentage cover of forest in the Caribbean is now up to about 30%. I had a look at UNEP-WCMC's, the World Conservation Monitoring Center's estimate for protected areas. For those of you that follow global conservation, you'll know that there was a big push to try and get 20% of global terrestrial areas protected, up to 17%. Well, actually in the Caribbean we're doing better. Our average is about 20%, or around 20%. So this is pretty good, but the picture is really mixed. And I put up this bottom graph here to illustrate the fact that it's not the same for all different kinds of habitats. And so for the birds that are here in the Caribbean, they're under different kinds of pressure depending on the taxonomic group that you're working in, depending on the species habitats that you're focusing on. So I'd say the picture in the Caribbean, it's optimistic, but it's mixed. So in terms of bird conservation, we're doing a job, we're doing a good job, but we could be doing better for many different species. Okay, so this is where I give you guys some work. I know normally when you get into a talk, you get told to turn your cell phones off, but I want everybody in the room to use their cell phone. So I set up this questionnaire, and I want to see how many people get this right. So I got this question for you about the percentage of Caribbean birds that are in decline. So if you go to this website, you should have a question, and Lisa and Adrian and Ellie, you guys can tell me whether or not this thing's working. Okay, so hopefully you've got a multiple choice question in there. You can tell me, and I will switch to my presentation. Okay, so it looks like 40% of the room think it's about 40%, and the rest are kind of in a normal distribution around that 51%. Okay, so I'm going to show you guys the answer in the second slide from here. So let's start with the migrant species. Okay, so there's actually a really great paper by Ken Rosenberg that came out in 2019, and Ken's paper was a pretty depressing read about declining migrants, for me anyway. But I actually went into the supplemental information that's in that paper. And in that paper, the supplemental information actually provides some really interesting things. So if you look in the top right-hand corner, that bit bar in red is the Caribbean. And it's got really wide confidence intervals, but what's interesting is that it's close to the positive side. It's probably the only region of migrants that's in a positive zone. Now, of course, we've had more than 2 decades worth of work on migrants in the Caribbean. see Greg sitting in the front there, so you can nod, Greg, for how much money you guys have spent in terms of supporting migrant conservation research here, right? But the truth is that for some species we can see recovering populations, for some species we're seeing continuing decline. I think for me though, what's interesting is how wide the confidence bars are on this, and it suggests to me that we need to do a lot more work in terms of monitoring in the region. So I think we need some more money from you, Greg. So the picture is mixed, certainly for migrants, but let's have a look at what's happening with our resident species. For the resident species, here's what the numbers look like. So if we look at residents as a whole, the graph at the top is the graph for total all the residents. And you'll see for the endangered residents, a lot of them are in trouble. And overall, probably about 47%, 48% of them are in decline. If we narrow down our field of view just to endemics, it gets more serious. We've got more than 55%. And so a lot of people that work on Caribbean birds, I think you guys are on the money in terms of what proportion of our species are in trouble. So at least 55% of our endemics are in decline. But what this graph also says to me is that for endemic species, which are really the most iconic things in the region, there's almost 10% of them that we have no idea what direction they're going in. So that's almost 20 species in the region. I think we could be doing better than that. James Carville in 1992, he coined a phrase, "Is the economy stupid?" during Bill Clinton's election campaign. There are some of us in this room that are old enough to remember that. I want to say that I'm going to plagiarize this and say it's the people stupid. If you work in the Caribbean, I'd say that if we want to address conservation, we have to focus on people. And so I think the issues that we need to focus on here are issues of public value. How does the public value nature? We need to focus on issues of human capacity in the region if we want to do real conservation management of these declining birds and their habitats. We need to focus on how do we finance sustainably conservation action in the region. And certainly we need to focus on governance, we need to focus on policy, we need to focus on legislative frameworks in the region. A lot of us are conservation and research specialists. This stuff that I'm talking about is stuff that can be hard for us to engage in. But I think even as we engage in this, even as we engage in this, there are opportunities for those of us that are interested in the research to fill some gaps, because actually each one of these bullet points, there are huge gaps in our understanding of how people feel about these things in the region. And I would argue that it's these human elements, these ultimate factors, that are just as, if not more important, than our demographic data, than our species distribution data. Because ultimately it's these people in the region that will decide the fate of these resident species and these migrants. As I close off my look on the current context for avian conservation, I'm going to take a leaf out of my colleague at the UCCRI, Bill Sutherland. Bill has made an industry out of coming up with conservation horizon scanning. I think probably almost every year he puts out a paper on conservation horizon scanning. So I'm going to do some horizon scanning of my own and tell you about the things that I look at when I think about Caribbean birds. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the CBD. I don't know how many people in the room are engaged in CBD renegotiations. So the Convention on Biological Diversity is the most important global framework on nature conservation. Its renegotiation of its targets for the next decade are really some of the most important discussions taking place globally if you're interested in nature conservation. And it's been really difficult at those negotiations, figuring out how much of the planet we should be protecting as protected areas, figuring out how much money and who's going to pay for that conservation, figuring out the role of indigenous people and local communities in conservation. Those discourses are really central to bird conservation in the region, and I think that if I had to look in my looking glass for the things that are going to shape the kinds of work that those of us in this room are interested in, well, it's something like the CBD and its renegotiation will be a key element of that future. Another element, of course, is financing. For those of us that work in the Caribbean, a lot of the governments that we work with, they rely on funds from the Global Environment Facility. Just recently, the Global Environment Facility was recapitalized. A lot of the donors agreed to provide funding, and they actually raised almost 30% more than they did the last time. And that took them up to a fund value of about $5.25 billion. Now that might sound like a lot of money, but the UN Environment Program just this year put out a report for the G20 that said actually we need to spend $536 billion a year in nature conservation. That makes the $5.25 billion that we've put aside for about 5 years worth of funding for biodiversity by the Global Environment Facility really paltry. And it says a lot about the challenges that we face trying to make these tiny amounts of money go somewhere and certainly support our conservation action. Another thing that sets the tone, I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about politics and talk about rising sensitivities about cultural issues. There's been a lot of political discourse about decolonialization. Certainly in the Caribbean, there's been a lot of talk about it. Where I work in Europe, there's been a lot of talk about it. And how do we do that? How do we help people to conserve what are their resources without telling them what to do? Well, there's things that we can do. Maybe we could listen some more. But that's certainly a big challenge. Another element of that is to be diverse. How do we make our communities of conservation diverse and representative of the people that we need to engage with when we do conservation? That's a challenge. And certainly a challenge that I think we should be up to addressing. And the other thing that I think is important is engaging indigenous and local people in conservation. This is, again, a really critical thing that we've known for a long time now, that conservation actions tend to work when we engage local people in the actions for management of the species and their habitats. I think that in the end, if we engage in those issues, we can see things shift. But for some reason, it's been really difficult to get ourselves to do this. The good thing when I look at what's coming up at our conference is that we've got some really amazing workshops and sessions that address just these issues on decolonialization, about diversity and inclusion, and about engaging local people. And I really encourage folks who haven't signed up or are in two minds about attending those sessions, because maybe I want to spend more time listening to people talk about research. I want to encourage folks that want to do conservation in the Caribbean to attend those sessions as well. So that was my whirlwind tour over my shift with the way things are today. There's a lot of stuff going on that I could talk about, but those are the things that I kind of focus on. I want to use a different tool now to look into the future, and that's scenario modeling. A lot of us in the room are used to seeing that, because certainly I don't think there's anybody that hasn't heard of the IPCC at this point. The scenario modeling from the IPCC, and there are probably almost every 2 years or so reports on the state of play with climate change, and seeing graphs that look something like this, that go off in directions that are generally down, that point to the potential outcome for climate and for human societies if we choose different pathways. As you heard before, I'm engaged in IPBES, and in IPBES we also do scenario planning for biodiversity. And one of the things that I've been involved with lately is the National Ecosystem Assessment for Grenada. For this National Ecosystem Assessment, we're trying to look at ecosystem values and how do we mainstream ecosystem values and help the government and the local people embrace these values, understand what they mean, and how we maximize those ecosystem values. In the Caribbean, actually, Grenada and the Dominican Republic are just two islands where national ecosystem assessments are being done. They're one of the only two islands globally to do them. So for me, when I think about scenarios for the future of Caribbean birds, if I want to be really simplistic, then I think maybe there's three directions I could go. I could look at a business as usual scenario, and my business as usual scenario, I call that 1984, in reference to George Orwell's dystopian future. And to be honest, with global geopolitics the way they are today, it's really grim if we continue down this road that we're doing. The future of collaboration and funding and what governments are willing to do could really change if we continue down this path that we're on, certainly politically. At the other end of the scale, I call that utopia. And in fact, I've used that title tongue-in-cheek. Utopia is the title of something written by Thomas More as a metaphor, a satire, if you will, on what the future could be. So when I was thinking about trying to come up with scenarios for Caribbean birds, really I could only focus on what might be the least objectionable future. If I had the time, what would be the things that we needed to do to have the least objectionable future for Caribbean birds, given that we're starting from a position where globally we've got a cost of living crisis and a potential recession, and bilateral monies will dry up if we enter into that recession. Climate change is starting to take hold, and certainly if we get a cost of living crisis in the Caribbean, then we're going to get a lot of pressure in rural landscapes from people doing subsistence agriculture and collecting fuel and firewood. So, what might our least objectionable future look like? Well, for me, a least objectionable future, at the very least, is one where we try to halt the decline of those species that I showed you in that graph earlier. How do we stop the decline of that almost 55% of Caribbean resident species? It's going to be a challenge, and a future that's at the very least not objectionable for me would also have sustainable finance. We need to find a mechanism that has sustainable financing in it. And how do we do that? For me, a sustainable future is one in which we have civil society really engaged in conservation. And that creates all kinds of challenges for us in a place where perhaps governments are less than willing to allow civil society to have control over natural resources. For us to even realize least objectionable future, we need to start upskilling in the Caribbean. We need to do more training of people in technical skills. And certainly, for me, when I think about it, I think about all the folks working in forest agencies across the region who consistently, every year I come back, for instance, to Grenada, I see a decline in the capacity in the state agencies to manage these natural resources. So these are some of the things that I think about when I think of what might be a future for bird conservation in the Caribbean. So, how do we get there? For this talk, I wanted to focus on post-COVID recovery, post-Maria, post-Sufrail. What does resilience look like? And first I started off by looking at the biological data. And I think it's Frank Rivera did some really interesting work that got published this year for Puerto Rico that, for me, epitomizes the state of play with species in the Caribbean. We've got, so Frank did this study, and I'm sure he's probably around. Hopefully he'll give a talk on his study of post-Maria recovery. But basically in this paper, he suggests that they studied a bunch of species, and for two of them, so for the scale-necked pigeon and the red-tailed hawk, they bounced back fantastically. They were resilient to that disturbance. But then we had one species, the Puerto Rican plain pigeon, that showed a tremendous decline. And so for me, when I look at that data, the thing that I started thinking about was the fact that actually we need really detailed species population numbers to really understand what each one of these different native species are doing. We can't generalize. This means that we need to have really good monitoring, really good landbird monitoring. And I want to congratulate BirdsCaribbean on the work that the organization has been doing to try and get landbird monitoring going in the region, certainly to get POTUS going with stations across the region, certainly to do shorebird monitoring. We need all of these things because actually when we look at the data, some of our species are resilient, but not all of them. And some of them really need a helping hand from us. So we need to pay attention. We need to be able to have that data to be able to cope. When I look at recovery in the Caribbean region, we need to leverage technology. There's no doubt about it, using remote sensing, LiDAR. We need to develop early warning systems. We need to have a much better system of monitoring. I know Joe Wonderly will be shaking his head because every time we speak, when we talk about long-term monitoring sites in the Caribbean, that we need one or more for each island in the Caribbean. Because we will need these monitoring sites in the face of global climate change. We need to have these things. So there's quite a lot of those kinds of questions that I want us to focus on. We need to be better at sharing natural resources across the region. I think when I think about our resource sharing, one of the things that comes to my mind is Cuba. When BirdsCaribbean said we were having this meeting in Puerto Rico, I was like, oh my gosh, at last I'm going to come back to Puerto Rico. And then I was really sad because I knew that we would not have our Cuban contingent that make up at least 1/4 of the people that come to our meetings at BirdsCaribbean. And I see the Cubans as having so much experience with doing so little in the Caribbean. And we need to do a better job. And this situation that we have just here reminds me that we need to do better with bird conservation in the region, to be able to share those human resources, to be able to share those technical resources, and also to explicitly recognize that our region has weaknesses, but it also has strengths. And when I talk about weaknesses, what I really mean is that, for instance, logistical challenges. I live in the UK, where for 50 US I can fly from one end of Europe to the other, no problem. But when you work in the Caribbean, to go 200 miles can cost an order, maybe 2 orders of magnitude more to fly across this region. This is a real problem for us when we start looking at projects and project development in the Caribbean. These are critical bottlenecks. The need for visas, all these things are real stranglehold for us as we plan bird conservation and trying to make it resilient in the region. I always would say capacity in the Caribbean is 1 person deep. Every time I talk to my colleagues, I just had a friend from Wisconsin say to me, oh, how you work in all these different places and all these different things. And it's because we in the Caribbean experience this, where because capacity is 1 person deep, you have no choice but to work on multiple things, right? That's a plus side because it allows us to have a syntopic view of nature conservation, and all the things that affect it. But it also means that we don't have the time to do the things that we want to do. And I think it's the 1 person deep trap that we need to get out of. And for us to look at resiliency in the islands, we need to find a way out of this trap. Certainly, learning from failure. In conservation science, we're not rewarded for reporting failures, but we spend a lot of money, and when we fail, we need to be able to get the message out to others. Trying to find ways to really innovate, and there are some situations that allow us to innovate. Situations that allow us to build relationships in the region, we need to find ways to do this. Because that's the only way that we're going to find culturally acceptable solutions, that we're going to get local people engaged. And the way to solve this is the engagement with other disciplines that have the same challenges working in the Caribbean region. I want to say that for me, when I look at action for the Caribbean birds, I see young people working for conservation. That's where the action is. And for that to happen, we need to have really good mentors, and we need to have really good schemes for developing those resources in the region. I see lots of young people in this room, and I'm so heartened to see that. Because certainly when I was your age, I don't know if I would be standing or sitting through a long-winded talk on conservation during a plenary, given the alternative. But I say that to say that actually in the region we've got lots of great people, lots of great human resources. The challenge is when I look at the statistics, our birds are still in decline, our protected areas still aren't large enough. We still need to set aside more areas, and our opportunities to do so, given the negotiations that I see going on at CBD, where we're talking about a new target of 30 by 30, which sounds good, it's great for biodiversity, but how we do that, where in some of our islands, 80% of the land is privately owned, that means even if the state set aside every square foot of land that they own, we still wouldn't meet 30 by 30 without engaging private landowners or local people. This says to me that those of us that work in bird conservation, we really need to engage with local people. To do that, we need good leaders in conservation. We have lots of good leaders, but not enough. Certainly not enough to address the challenge. And I think that if we look at the scale of the work that faces us, the need to build stakeholder consensus, the need to develop new finance, the need to find ways to inspire transformational change, that we have to have these leaders. So I'm getting close to the end, and I've got one more audience thing for you to do. Do you see yourself as a conservation leader in the Caribbean? I really would love to see the answer to this. That's really interesting. So it seems like the room's kind of split 50-50. Well, I'm going to leave that open for folks to have a look at that. But, you know, there's a lot of maybes and no, not at all in there. And the thing is, I want to say that, you know, I spent the last 3 years at Cambridge training the next generation of conservation professionals. Every year in my course, I take about 20 students, and in a year of 20 students, I've got them coming from 18 different countries. And this photo actually is of the 2019 cohort, and there's 2 of them from Bahamas in there, and I never felt so proud as having 2 Bahamians in the room. And the truth is that, you know, for those people who said that they don't see themselves as leaders, all leadership is situational. You don't have to be the president of the organization, the head of the agency or whatever, to be a leader. Good leaders have some specific qualities, yes, and back in the day we used to think that, you know, good leaders were born, but today we know that there are lots of skills that leaders have, and we can train people to get. Self-awareness, strategic thinking, innovation, emotional intelligence, these are all things we can teach our students to do. And it's critical that we develop more leadership in the Caribbean. And as I'm getting closer to the end, with a personal story. So this is a photo of me in the lower left-hand corner. This is 1993 in Cuba at a BirdsCaribbean meeting. Okay, and to the right is me not so long ago, meeting with blackbirders and with my family of BirdsCaribbean, trying to sell merch as I get told to do by Lisa all the time. But you know, I remember when I was in grad school, I said to my PhD advisor, you know, I'm a wildlife biologist, this is all I want to do. And I know Peter, our assistant in the room, I don't know, Peter, if you could visualize this, stand looking at me quizzically and then say, well, you have to be more than that now. You know, and at the time, I didn't get it, but I get it now. To work in this region that has so much diversity, so much human potential, requires us to do more. I was just 25 when I came to my first VC meeting in San Juan Viejo. And it was transformational. I never thought I would be leading this organization 20 years later. I never thought that I'd be standing here, almost 30-something years later, talking to you guys about conservation leadership. If I could do it, anybody could do it. And I have to say that in terms of being a leader, that conversation, Lisa, with the blackbirders was perhaps one of the most profound, looking at the next generation, trying to talk to them about the challenges they have being people of color in conservation. And I want to say to the young folks in the room that, listen, if I could do it, you guys definitely could. And so here are my things that I wish you could do for bird conservation, all of you. If you're not from the region, go talk to a Caribbean conservation professional and ask what you can do to help. And be creative. There's lots of ways you can help, I'm sure, if you put your mind to it. For the young conservation biologists, I think, do see yourselves as leaders. This is critical, we need it. And for the older generation in the room, it's time to step up and mentor the younger generation. It's time to do it. We need that now. So I just want to stop there and say thank you very much for bearing with me.